Just want to welcome people as they're coming in. As I say at about this time every week, it appears that the Zoom digital door is a single file door, and people are just kind of flowing in one by one right now. We'll give it, as usual, another minute or so before I start actually speaking and we begin the panel. All right. I think it's about that time. I believe some more people will come filtering in the next few minutes, but I figure we should get started. And most people are here to see the panel anyway, and so I'll take up as little airtime as possible. So, hello, and welcome to the Smart Equitable Commonwealth, co-creating the society we want. My name is Dan O'Brien, and I'm the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, and happy to have you here. This is the 7th week of the conference, and we have an exciting discussion today about making housing in Greater Boston work for everyone. Before we get started, though, I feel it's necessary for us to talk about something else. This has been a somber week for our city and for our nation, and I'm certainly not the first to tell you that George Floyd, a Black man, died last week at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We've seen cities across the country, Boston included, react with both sadness and righteous anger, and a collective voice that has made itself heard every night this week, chanting the refrain that Black Lives Matter, that events like this are not okay, and that they are atrocities, and that there must be change. This is not new to any of us, right? George Floyd was not the first. He was preceded by Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, and those are just the recent examples. There's a deeper history here, and it goes back decades and centuries. But as we all know too well, police brutality really is only the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the most egregious and nameable offense regularly committed against Black Americans. The legacy of systemic racism permeates every aspect of our lives: income, employment opportunities, housing, public school, transit, exposure to pollution, access to amenities. The list goes on. This is what demands our attention, not just when a Black person dies at the hands of a white police officer, but every day. Despite how sad this moment is, I do hold onto a sliver of hope. There was a video that went viral the other day of George Floyd's daughter saying, "My daddy changed the world." And that stood out to me, maybe just because I have young children as well. But I really hope she's right, and that we honor his memory, his loss, her loss in that way. Because this moment calls for action, and we must all do our part. Otherwise, George Floyd's death and all the marches that have followed will have been in vain, and we just cannot let that happen. So, to that effect, I want to say that I hope and believe that the BARI community will rise to this occasion, as it is central to our mission. We will do so through our research policy collaborations, and our commitment to evidence-based policies that acknowledge not only data, but also the interests, needs, and lived experiences of those communities being served. Through our trainings and consultations that enable our public and nonprofit partners to be empowered to describe what data and technology do and do not hold for them and their constituencies. And through our programmed content, like this conference, where a diverse set of voices can present and discuss evidence of inequities and explore potential solutions. In sum, we here at BARI stand with our Black colleagues, students, and partners, and I ask you all to do the same. And we will continue in everything we do to contribute to and invest in an inclusive public conversation that charts a pathway forward for Greater Boston, one that leverages data and technology to enhance equity, justice, and democracy in the cities and communities of the 21st century. So with that said, we have to turn to the panel for today, which is why you're all here, and it's rather resident, right? Making housing in Greater Boston work for everyone, really getting at this central question of equity and equal access and the most fundamental amenity there is, having a roof over one's head and a place to call home. And in this moment when we are all home quite a bit more than we usually are, it's even more pressing, as I believe our panelists will get to. Today's moderator, Luke Schuster, is uniquely positioned to lead that conversation. He is director of Boston Indicators at the Boston Foundation, where he and his team use data to expose all sorts of disparities in our city. He also oversees the Boston Foundation's annual housing report card and has deep knowledge in this domain. And so I would trust nobody more to lead this conversation and to help us explore it. Before I turn over to Luke, though, I have a few requisite announcements that I must make every week. The podcasts for our first 6 panels are now available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. This is also where you will find all future podcasts released each Friday morning, so please be sure to subscribe. And also, during the talk today, the Q&A is open as always, but also be sure to, if you're using Twitter, to tweet at us at BARI Boston or hashtag BARI 2020 for the conference. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Luke to take it away.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate that level setting before we get into this research discussion. Maybe actually just building really briefly on your sort of note, making a call to action. I increasingly feel like housing policy just needs to be at the top of the list for local levers for change, right there next to criminal justice and police reform. A lot of the big pressing issues that frustrate all of us are best tackled, frankly, by the federal government. Housing policy is one area where it's almost directly in our state and local control. And frankly, because the federal government over many years has continued to scale back investments in public housing, it's just all the more in our direct control to make change on this front. So I hope a lot of the discussion over the next hour focuses on the best thinking around what we need to do to address these challenges. The research done by the 4 presenters, it's important to note, was done many months ago before the COVID pandemic hit our communities and before the much more recent uprisings in Boston and other cities in the state and country. In planning for this event, we acknowledged that fact and wanted to just make a commitment to infuse the presentation of that research, both directly during the presentations, but also during the Q&A, with thoughts about how these trends might look different if they were based on data that was much more present. I think in many ways the trends may be in similar directions, but just accelerated. So let's all sort of keep that in mind as we discuss the research. I thought I would just share one quick data point from recent work we've done that speaks to how interrelated these issues are. Right after the COVID outbreak began in our area in sort of early to mid-March, there was a growing conversation around the fate of cities and might the spread of the virus lead to concerns about living in dense urban areas, because when people live in close proximity to each other, they may be at higher risk of infection, we've done some work, and many folks I know on this call are doing work trying to understand the dynamics that have led some places to see greater outbreaks than others. One of the findings from early work we have done is that one of the factors most associated with cities and towns in Massachusetts that have had higher rates of COVID-19 infections is communities with higher shares of their population living in overcrowded housing. And so the issue is more than just people living in cities. It's really much more specifically an issue of people living in inadequate housing. And let me show one graph that I think just demonstrates this. This is a scatter plot of the 100 largest cities and towns in Massachusetts, comparing their positive COVID case rate on the x-axis with a measure of overcrowding on the y-axis. And you can see a very strong relationship between communities that have more inadequate housing, more occupants living in a home per room, and places that have seen the greatest outbreak. Chelsea in particular, I suspect everybody knows, has had the highest COVID infection rate in Massachusetts. Basically 10% of people living in Chelsea live in an overcrowded home, according to this measure. So I look at data like this and I feel sort of simultaneously really frustrated and also motivated to make sure that we as a region and state provide better, adequate housing options for all types of residents of our state. So with that, let me first pass it to Tim Reardon, who's been doing a lot of great work at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council around exactly these issues and how these dynamics really vary across the greater Boston region. He's going to present work on sort of detailing housing markets subtypology for greater Boston. Tim? Don't forget to unmute yourself, Tim.
Of course, it had to happen. It happens to the first presenter. Hopefully, it won't happen to any others. I'm looking forward to presenting some work that our team has done on Metro Boston's regional housing submarkets over the past year or so. Work conducted by Saliki Flingai, who couldn't be here to present today, Sara Philbrick, and our data research manager, Jesse Partridge. And this work is predicated on the understanding that that different policies are needed for different contexts. And as Luke pointed out, housing planning and policy development is overwhelmingly driven at the municipal level, where zoning decisions are made, siting decisions are made, and many funding decisions are made, as well as a lot of decisions that bear on fair housing issues and the opportunity for people of different races, ethnicities, and incomes to access housing. And in doing that planning work, many municipal officials, consultants, or even regional agencies such as our own often rely on municipal level statistics or comparison communities in order to contextualize housing conditions. You're working in Lexington and they want to know, well, what are things like in Concord and Weston or Winchester? But municipalities are heterogeneous, and some neighborhoods are more like other places in the region than they are like nearby areas in the same city or town. And so our question is, how do we account for neighborhood variability and surface that neighborhood variability within a community while also exposing the similarities in order to craft effective housing policies that are targeted to appropriate conditions? So one option for that is what we call housing submarket segmentation. And a housing submarket is a collection of neighborhoods, some might be near each other and some are at quite some distance, that share similarities in the housing stock and housing market characteristics. How many rental units are available? How many single family homes are there, or 3-bedroom units? How much deed restricted housing is available? How many homes are purchased by cash buyers or lost to homeowners through foreclosure? All of these characteristics determine who can find, afford, and remain in suitable housing in that neighborhood. And I'll point out many of these characteristics are also ways that over prior decades and centuries have been employed and levied specifically to exclude Black and Brown people from communities, especially suburban communities, through redlining and other measures. So we think a housing submarket analysis would be useful because it provides a way for local stakeholders to both understand diversity within their own community as well as similarity to other parts of the region, so that we can develop coalitions that will support regional solutions. It can help facilitate the development and implementation of policy responses, so we're not reinventing the wheel every time we get to a community, but we actually have a toolbox to start with that's sensitive to the housing market in that place. And it can also help to facilitate research that's relevant by classifying findings and outcomes by different submarkets. So in this, one of our inspirations was work that was done by the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. And you can find their work at the URL at the bottom of the page. And our counterparts in the Chicagoland, Chicago Metropolitan Area Planning, use that work in their local housing technical assistance. And so we're looking to recreate a similar thing here using a variety of data inputs and methods, which are all listed here. I won't go through them all, but they include information such as basic information such as rents and home values, changes in rents and home values, how many rental units there are, how much foreclosure activity and cash sales there are, how many 3-bedroom units, single family, how much has been built recently, many, many different dimensions. And we used a statistical classification technique called latent profile analysis to cluster census tracts in all across 101 municipalities of the MAPC region and identified 7 distinct submarkets. And I'm going to show you a map of those very shortly, but I want to show you a couple scatter plots which demonstrate why latent profile analysis is useful. This shows our submarkets on the x-axis there, and housing density for each one, and grouped into the box plots show the quartiles. And there's a clear, we've sorted them by housing density, and you can see there's, some are more dense than others. But it's not only a function of, say, single family units. You can see submarket 6, while relatively low density, also only has a moderate share of single family homes. So some variables such as density aren't necessarily correlated specifically with single family housing stock. Similarly, we might look at home value and change in value and see that those that have the highest value are not necessarily those that have seen the greatest change in median home sale price over this period. So there's a lot of variables that don't correlate with each other, and latent profile analysis is a useful way of trying to find these groups within many different characteristics. And I'll walk through those very quickly now. Submarket 1 are what we call these premium priced urban core neighborhoods like Back Bay, Beacon Hill, the South End, parts of Cambridge and Brookline. Very high density and very high prices, and a mix of both old and new development. Submarket 2 are lower cost urban markets in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Everett, and Chelsea, with many subsidized units, but also unfortunately many foreclosures and cash sales, which can exclude lower income homeowners from buying those units, and also rapid price escalation. Submarket 3 are these neighborhoods of 1, 2, and 3 family homes, and some single family homes. And in those, we've seen a strong shift over recent years to home ownership through condo conversion and the development of home ownership versus rental units. Submarket 4 are kind of the first generation of post-war suburbs, which remain relatively lower cost single family homes, but have seen relatively little growth or change or infill in the last 20 years. Submarket 5, the most expensive submarket in the region, these premium price suburbs, very stable, very exclusive, very little single family homes, and almost no opportunities for lower income households to move in. Submarket 6, the one I pointed out earlier, are these very interesting suburban edges and new centers. These are the places where we've seen large multifamily housing developments happening sort of on the peripheries of many suburban communities, near highway interchanges or in former industrial areas, that have created more rental housing opportunities but aren't really integrated within the fabric of the community. And then finally, submarket 7, the vast majority of the region that's been developed as suburbs in the latter half of the 20th century, but have seen relatively little growth in the last 20 years. You put it all together and you can sort of start to see this mosaic of the way it lays out across the region. Our next steps are to finalize the documentation and publish this summer, and in doing so, to conduct an overlay analysis to see how important factors that relate to personal outcomes such as job accessibility, education outcomes, environmental exposure, race and ethnicity, historical patterns such as redlining correlate with these submarkets. We want to link them submarkets to particular policy recommendations that are appropriate in different contexts, and also talk to folks about how they see this analysis being useful and what they need to make this research actionable. So thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing folks' questions.
Thanks, Tim. One test of whether or not folks are producing research that's useful in the real world is if other researchers are on their own stumbling across the work and using it. And I can say both to the work Tim just presented and then also to the transit-oriented development work that Tom Hopper is about to present, that is the case for Boston Indicators. We have used most of their work, really invaluable. So just really appreciate those contributions. So with that, let me pass it to Tom Hopper from the Center for Housing Data at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership to talk about their TODEX tool.
I did the same thing, forgot to unmute. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Luke. My name is Tom Hopper. I'm the Director of Research and Analytics at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. And I'm here to present TODEX, a transit-oriented development explorer for Massachusetts. Let me just make sure you are looking at a PowerPoint presentation right now. Is that right? Perfect. Great. So what is TODEX? TODEX is an interactive website that allows visitors to compare residential density across neighborhoods served by MBTA commuter rail and rapid transit lines. Our goal here was to make those comparisons of density really easy and really immediate so that people could quickly identify meaningful variations in residential patterns. But also we hope to shed light on how local differences in zoning and land use decisions, some of what Tim was talking about in terms of local decision making, point out how those are potentially limiting the development of denser housing options in many of the locations that have really good transit service. So the site includes our detailed methodology, complete access to underlying data, and a research brief that digests some of these key findings from our research. So today I'm going to go through some of our research steps. I'm going to start with how we defined station areas. So in creating station areas, we started with a half-mile radius. And you can see that here around each of the 261 stations in our study area, we drew a half-mile buffer. We wanted these station areas to be mutually exclusive so that we were counting parcels and units only once and attributing them to just one station area. And then finally, we took out open space and water so that when we were constructing density metrics, we weren't penalizing any communities that are coastal or have a lot of natural features. Once we had our geography set, it was time to just count units. And in order to do this, we used three complementary, all imperfect and incomplete data sets to do this so that we can overcome some of the weaknesses that the data sets have individually and really triangulate and come up with a more accurate, count of data, of units. So we used assessor's parcel records from MassGIS and City of Boston's open data portal. We used master address data, also administered by MassGIS, and this is used for statewide 911 services. And finally, we used CoStar, which is a paid real estate data service. To provide a few examples of how we use this data, we took the assessor's data, and for a parcel, here's an example of a 4 to 8 unit apartment building. The assessor says 6 units. We then counted up the number of addresses that fell within that parcel, and if they matched, we were good to go. Everything looked good, and we took that as fact. In some cases, though, the assessor's data had something that seemed like an inappropriate value for that particular use. And so a 4 to 8 unit apartment building with 1 unit didn't make sense, but an address count from the address data might give us a more accurate picture of what was on that parcel. Finally, there were even more complex situations where neither the assessor's data nor the address counts really provided us with something satisfying. And there we did individual parcel research in CoStar to determine a more accurate number of units. And we also did that for large multifamily projects across the site, just because those have a big bearing on density and we wanted to get them right. Once we had our unit counts and our geography figured out, we were able to construct density metrics. And we did this on both the parcel level and the aggregate station area level. And so here's an example in Montello Station in Brockton. Each one of these little squares in this leftmost picture depicts a residential parcel, and we applied a color ramp. So darker colors are indicating higher levels of residential density. In order to aggregate those up to a station area density, we just simply counted the number of units in this station area, so 1,700 for Montello, divided it by the total acreage of that defined station area, and came up with a resulting average gross density for that station area. So Montello has 3.6 units per acre, which is not a particularly high density level. So we did this for each one of the 261 cities and towns, not cities and towns, 261 stations in our study area. And then came the fun part, to share this information and have people interact with it. And so now I'm going to hopefully seamlessly transition to our website, mhp.net/todex, where you are greeted with an interactive map where you can click on any one of these station areas. Let's pick Wollaston to start with, and start to explore patterns of low residential density, patterns of higher level residential density where we might have some multifamily housing, and also view some overall statistics for that area. So Wollaston has about 3,000 housing units and an average density of 6.4 units per acre. We can compare that to somewhere, this was the Braintree line, we can compare that to the Ashmont line. So Shawmut, my neighborhood, we can see is about twice as dense with 13.8 units per acre and about 3,800 total units. But then we can start to compare with some of our suburban friends, and let's pick on, let's say Ashland today. Ashland has about 835 units and 1.9 units per acre. And you can really see some of these larger lots here, mostly with single family homes, and so very low density. Let me walk through, we're tight on time, but let me walk through a few other components of the website. We have a methodology tab where you can download data and view a lot of what I talked about in this presentation. We have a data tab where you can sort, filter, and download the data on the station area level and use that in your own analysis. And we have a research brief tab where we go over some of our top level findings. I don't have time to go over them now, but one that I would like to highlight is just the range in residential density that we saw across all of these station areas. And overall, on average, we saw about 6.6 units per acre across all of these areas. And that's very low density. So we did a thought experiment. If we were to take that 6.6 and make it 10 units per acre, if we were to achieve a slightly higher but still modest level of density, how many more housing units would we have? And the answer is 243,000 additional housing units. And so while this is not exact science, it does indicate that there's potential if we focus on density and standards around these transit stations to achieve a huge impact on our housing stock and relieve some of our housing supply issues. So we do have some next steps and some rethinking of this project, and hopefully we get to that in the Q&A because I'm at time. So I am going to turn it back over to Luke at this point. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom, and good job with time. Next, let me pass it to Sujin Conover. I hope I'm getting that right. Her work helping create the community housing data tool.
Thank you, Luke. So let me share my screen. Do you see? Okay. Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sujin Conover from Vital Village Network at Boston Medical Center. Today, I would like to introduce the Community Housing Data Tool, an interactive tool sharing data linking health and housing across the city of Boston. And I will talk about how we share data through a community-driven approach. So before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce who we are. Vital Village is a network of residents and organizations committed to maximizing child, family, and community well-being. We closely work with Boston communities, and with a number of different projects, we engage community members and organizations in different sectors so we can co-create solutions. Also, Vital Village has shared the data through Community Data Dashboard to promote equity and establish a shared ownership of data and benchmarks for assessing the well-being of families and children in our community. So what is Community Housing Data Tool? It is a web-based tool sharing data for health advocacy. It tends to provide information and resources to families and organizations who are interested in learning more about the state of housing in Boston communities. It shares various types of data maps and resources linking health and housing. The tool uses data mapping because it allows us to see spatial disparities in data, if there is any, and identify areas that need our attention and intervention to address some of the inequity issues. It also can lift up community assets and allow us to see where they are. One thing I would like to highlight here is that Community Housing Data Tool was first developed in a way to respond to the needs from the community. Several community members came forward and said, we need housing data to better understand inequitable housing situation in Boston. So it was co-created with the Community Data Work Group, a diverse team of community residents and community partner organizations. They were heavily involved from the very beginning of its development and provided valuable direction in making the framework and topics in the tool. So the whole process can be described as a participatory and community-driven approach. So these are the 4 topics and 3 focus population groups identified by Community Data Work Group. The work group wanted to integrate equity within data sharing efforts by lifting up voices of groups of populations who are relatively less highlighted in discussions on housing, such as returning citizens and single fathers. So we hosted a storytelling workshop, and now we are currently making and editing a story video, and the participant community members are working with us and giving us feedback. So we are planning to share the community stories in the data tool in the near future. So if you visit vitalvillage-housingdata.org, this is the landing page you will be able to explore each topic. We encourage audience here today to check out the data tool. The tool has a conventional housing data, including eviction rate or renter burden, but it also has relatively unconventional data. One example is needle pickup request. Let's take a look at the page. If you visit the tool and click the first top box, it leads to the topic. So this data map shows needle pickup requests to the city of Boston at the census tract level in 2018. The number of needle pickup requests has been increasing over the past few years, from about 1,800 reports in 2016 to over 4,600 reports in 2018. In 2019, it was over 7,000. So the implication for housing is that it is a community safety issue, particularly for children, because children can be pricked by discarded needles in nearby playgrounds, parks, school during recess, or on the sidewalk outside their home. And this tool has several interactive attributes that you can use. You can select layers you want to see on a data map by checking boxes on the legend. And if you enter your address, you can see your location on the data map. And if you click each feature on a map, detailed information pops up in a box. And for example, if you are a parent and curious to see where my child's school is, and if the school is in a relatively safe area for needle disposal, you can use this data map. And some of our network members are using data from the tool for community advocacy projects. As we are going through COVID-19 pandemic, community partners and residents have come together to support each other. As a part of that effort, the tool's eviction resource page is sharing information and resources related to housing and eviction coming from the city, and as well as housing advocacy organizations, because eviction is a public health challenge more than ever. We also recently made this tool mobile friendly by using a mobile optimized platform so users can easily navigate the tool with their mobile devices. So we're currently working to further develop the tool under the guidance of community members and partner organizations. So we really appreciate all the partnerships from our funders and partners, and we are hoping that community housing data tool will help promote equitable and safe housing environments in all Boston neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Sujin. You all have been great at keeping on time. Really appreciate it. So last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Nick Henninger, whose work very related, but a bit different in nature. It's a research paper on the politics and practice of non-local control in urban rental markets. Nick? You're on mute if you're talking.
All right. Hi, Luke. Great. So today I will be talking about the politics and practice of non-local control in urban rental markets. So with the retrenchment and privatization of the US welfare system, The median low-income renter in America's cities rents from a private landlord and is unsubsidized by the federal government. As such, the landlords operating in these low-income areas hold immense economic and political power. In particular, if there is a high rate of non-local landlords in a neighborhood, this can be especially problematic, especially when these landlords are not descriptive of their tenant population and do not support the same political causes. And just a note here, we use non-local instead of absentee, and we define non-local as 1 mile away from the property. So in this study, we use comprehensive property ownership data from 3 American cities, Boston, Detroit, and Milwaukee, in order to account for variations in the density of non-local landlords across the urban space. The results are mapped using ArcGIS and analyzed using geographically weighted regression. Following that, we matched this property ownership data with political donation data to analyze whether landlords are using their voice in city politics. In particular, we analyze the landlord response to a 2017 bill for renter protections in the city of Boston. So for our preliminary results here, we see that in the city of Boston, about 60% of landlords reside within 1 mile of the property under study. Whereas in Milwaukee, this is a very low 28%. And similarly, if you look at more than 50 miles away, Boston has about 6% of landlords who are more than 50 miles distant from their property, while in Milwaukee, about 13% of landlords are in that category. Now, the bread and butter of non-local landlords is really the suburban areas surrounding a city, and that is something that I do emphasize in this research. So as we can see with these maps of Boston, Detroit, and Milwaukee, it is definitely not a random assignment across the city in terms of the density of non-local landlords. There is definitely some forces at play here, and that is what we really tried to figure out using a geographically weighted regression model. So for our independent variables, we looked at median household income, the percentage Black or African American in the neighborhood, the percentage Hispanic or Latino, the percentage aged 18 to 24. This is a proxy for college student populations, and the percentage of housing units that are condominiums, which is a proxy for overall housing type variance. And as you can see, the model was strongest in cities like Detroit and Milwaukee, while in cities like Boston that have had higher rates of gentrification and have a very high rate of student population, the model wasn't actually as strong. And we can talk a little bit further about that later. So I really want to highlight this comparison here of tenant race by census tract and the density of non-local landlords by census tract. And as you can see in a city like Milwaukee, which is extremely segregated, the map between landlord non-locality and tenant race overlaps perfectly with one another. In fact, this variation in tenant race explains about 22% of the overall variation in whether or not a landlord will choose to reside close to or far away from the property. Similarly, it's even stronger. 23% of the variation in Detroit is accounted for based on race of the tenant. In Boston, once again, we see that that's not particularly the case. It might have been some decades ago, but in modern Boston, we do see neighborhoods like Brighton, which have a very high student population, really bringing in some of those non-local landlords. So a brief note on the mechanism here. Landlord profit is simply their rental income minus the property cost. And so landlords are able to charge very high rents for a substandard product when their rental population is either unable or unwilling to become a homeowner. And I think that if you think about being unable, you talk about low income, poor credit, and or a history of discrimination. Or unwilling, we talk about college student populations and their transients. And so recognizing these sorts of profit opportunities, non-local and solely profit-driven landlords target their investments to the most vulnerable areas. So why does this matter? We have decades of research showing that non-local landlords and absentee landlords more generally have lower levels of property maintenance. But what I really like to highlight is that every first of the month, we see a continuous funneling of rents from poorer communities to richer communities. And this is most clear in cities like Detroit and Milwaukee, where the median renter tract has in Detroit 3% of a white population, whereas the owner tract is over 40% white. And we see that the incomes in renter versus owner tracts are about half of the owner tract median income. So there's significant revenues coming out of poor communities and going to richer communities every month. Now, these dollars, unfortunately, are not always spent in the best political interests of tenant populations. Many times these dollars then become donations to political officials at the urban level. So we see that from the list of landlords that were identified in this study, 19% of donations to Mayor Marty Walsh between 2016 and 2018 matched that list of landlords. And about 21% of those landlords were originating outside of the city of Boston. In particular, when we look at city councilors who voted against a fair housing related bill in 2017, each of these councilors has an elevated rate of landlord matches, meaning that they have a higher rate of their donations coming from landlords, and an extremely elevated rate of these landlords being outside of the city of Boston. So as we reflect on the murder of George Floyd, one of the things that keeps coming up is this idea of property versus people. And what I would really like to highlight is that poverty, desperation, and exclusion are profitable, especially to a certain group of landlords. The undermining of Black lives, from slavery to redlining and blockbusting, to localized school funding, to rental property neglect, has always been tied to the short-term profitability of landowning, primarily white and male interests. As we know from recent research from the Boston University School of Public Health, segregated neighborhoods and cities have higher rates of police violence. So for some next steps, this project will be expanded to include over 20 US cities, and will incorporate voter file data for both landlords and tenants to really assess all of the political behavior of each group. And secondly, I would note that this forms part 1 of a 3-paper dissertation. Part 2 will talk about landlords who are operating in moments of gentrification and neighborhood change and how they relate to city officials during those times. And part 3 will talk about the power of landlords who are renting to undocumented tenants, which is obviously an important topic in this time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick, for really important bodies of work. Here's a thought for how to do Q&A for the next 15 or so minutes. A few questions came in during the presentations that are technical, or at least, if not technical, specific to those presentations. Why don't we do a sort of quick round of trying to address some of those while they're fresh, and then zoom back out to a couple bigger picture questions. So I will try and direct these first few to the researchers that they relate to, and we'll do these relatively quickly if that's good. So first couple for Tim, since you went first, and maybe I'll actually just read them both and you can try and tackle them both if that's all right. The first is, how do you decide how many submarkets to include in the algorithm? And was there an empirical number you decided on ahead of time, or did you choose them based on clusters that best fit the data? And then the second is, have you evaluated the correlation between submarkets and transportation access?
Great. These are excellent questions. We tried a variety of many different submarket numbers ranging from 5 to 10, and then ended up sort of really going back and forth between 7 and 8 at the end in terms of what would best fit the data. And for those who haven't used it, latent profile analysis provides a probability that a given unit of, in this case, tract is a member of a certain class. So it could be that it's 99% sure that it belongs in class number 5, or it could be there's a 40% chance it's in 5, a 40% chance it's in 3, and a 10% 20% chance it's in 2. So so we tried to that's kind of how it was driven. We wanted to sort of try to get those probabilities as high as we could, and there were still a handful of tracks that were uncertain, but a relatively small number. As far as the correlation of submarkets to transportation access, that's what we want to look at with the overlays, right? Because The submarkets describe the housing market conditions, that is the stock and prices that are available. And then what we want to do is look at the opportunities, assets, and threats associated with living in that neighborhood. Is it a place where you can access schools with high test scores or with good transportation access or lots of environmental exposure? And I would add, how do these also correlate to, for example, the history of redlining in places that were redlined or blockbusted in the last century?
Thanks, Tim. The second question is for Tom, although I think my rushed opening comment around the overcrowding may have led to some confusion because I did it so quickly. The question is, I can see how high density can be problematic in terms of housing crowding, but I also think it's beneficial to increase accessibility and live close to transit. What's the goal? To have more or less density near these stations? Let me just say a quick thing and then maybe pass it to Tom. There's an important distinction to make between density and overcrowding. A density measure is something that just looks at the number of people living per square mile. Overcrowding more specifically looks at the number of people living in a housing unit per number of rooms in that unit. So you can be a dense city, but not have residential overcrowding if you have adequate housing options in that dense city. Tom, any other thoughts to layer on?
Yeah, I'd say I think for me, yes, the goal is to have more housing density in places that offer high levels of mobility. But it's not just about rail stations, and it's not just about packing in as many housing units as we can. It's about creating really functional, complete communities where people have access to all of the things they need. There's a concept of 15-minute neighborhoods. And these are where can you get to essential services and locations within a 15-minute walk of where you live? Can you get to a grocery store? Can you get to a library? Can you get to all these things? And I think one of the things that we're hoping comes out of the crisis is people think more about the community that they live in and whether or not that community is complete, and see transit not just as a way of getting to their job in downtown Boston, but think about mobility in their community and how they're accessing the things that they need, and whether or not they can do that. And perhaps most importantly is who else is able to access that? And do you have the housing in your community to offer people from all walks of life? Or are you being exclusionary, right? And so those are the changes I hope happen, but to answer the question more directly, I think it is density, but it's the right types of density.
See one new question, mostly for Nick, which is there data showing a similar influence of non-local landlords associated with large suburban rental developments on local politics?
That is a great question and a great area for further research. I haven't come across too much work in this category, generally speaking. It is definitely an understudied topic in terms of landlords and the power of specifically absentee landlords and non-local landlords. So I have not seen any studies, or I cannot reference any studies that would be useful in that regard.
One other question that is sort of for all the researchers, if any of you have a thought on this, jump in. Has anyone looked at larger apartment buildings and whether they're built and managed to encourage turnover or longer tenancy? For example, every Cambridge developer that I've asked about expected annual turnover to has estimated the annual turnover at about 50 to 100%.
I mean, the folks in the development community that I've talked to about this, I mean, turnover is not a good thing because it just brings with it a lot of hassle and the potential for lost rent if you have, a month of unpaid of vacancy in between your turnover. So while I think there are some landlords that would, pursue predatory practices of evicting people and being able to keep the last month's rent or the security deposit as a result of that, I think don't get the sense that is like a major kind of corporate strategy, but rather one of smaller and mid-sized landlords.
Folks should keep sending in questions as we talk. Let me transition to a couple bigger picture policy questions that are on my mind, and see where the conversation goes. So I'll ask this just to anybody who's interested in chiming in. I feel like in the last couple of months, as the world has really shifted beneath our feet, there's been a growing conversation around what an opportunity this provides to redesign systems so that there's less social and racial inequality when we rebuild. And my one concern about that conversation is just, it feels a bit to me like assuming those changes will just happen because there is change afoot. But I really feel like the fate of whether these challenges lead to positive change or just further negative change really depends on the organizing and advocacy that we do towards specific policy ends. So the question is, what's your vision for a reformed approach to housing in our region and state? If you were governor, if you were mayor, what would be at the top of your agenda for building a more equitable approach to housing in our region? And by the way, don't feel like I'm pushing you to adopt a formal organizational position, but I'd love to hear concrete ideas that we might focus more organizing around.
Maybe I just chime in and say that a crisis hardly ever makes things better for those who were suffering before it, right? And so I think we're seeing that very clearly right now, that some of the systemic issues that we were experiencing prior to COVID-19 are being exacerbated by that crisis and revealing some of those inequities and laying them bare. And I'd say if we're not careful and if we don't take really aggressive steps, that stands to get worse in a recovery. The economic impacts of the crisis are going to take a very, very long time to dig our way out of. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people to take advantage of some of that fallout to make money, right? And to come out ahead. And we have to be very vigilant in the public sector to make sure that we're taking opportunities to take some of the temporary measures that we're seeing to support people during the crisis and make sure that we're supporting people afterwards, so that in the best of times, we have better outcomes for the people who need that support, so that the next time a crisis comes, we're not seeing those same patterns emerge. So I don't know exactly what those measures are, but this is the time to be vigilant and push for them.
That's very well put, Tom. I totally agree. I think a couple specific things which we're concerned about. I think one is, while the combination of the CARES Act and the state's eviction moratorium have protected renters to some extent for the time being, I think we are seeing a looming crisis come August 1st when the expanded unemployment benefits associated with the CARES Act expires, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of renter households will be at risk of, both having to deal with back rent if they haven't been able to keep current, or now all of a sudden losing the additional government assistance at exactly the same time that they're losing the moratorium, the eviction moratorium protection that they have right now. And so in that case, there's a need to extend that the moratorium and to provide more rental assistance support. I think the other thing, and just to sort of pick up on Tom's comments about dealing with the problems of the last crisis, a corollary piece of analysis that we've been doing on speculative investment has found, as most folks would know, like a big increase in institutional investors and speculative investors that occurred in 2009 and 2010. While we didn't have a big real estate crash, we still saw an increase in institutional investment. The Brookings Institution and Jenny Schutz has documented this nationally, and it's continued since then. And you see more and more large institutional or corporate investors who are buying not just large apartment buildings, but going down to the 9 and 6 unit buildings. And so fewer and fewer of those are then owned by local landlords who are going to be a little more flexible about the rent. And I think if the crisis then causes more small-time landlords to experience financial stress because their tenants can't pay and can't get additional assistance, then what's going to happen is more and more of the housing stock is going to be captured by those who still have capital, and that's going to be corporate investors. And so you're going to see more and more multifamily housing that goes into professional corporate management that's much more oriented towards, extraction of the maximum rents, very little leniency with regard to late payments and all that sort of thing. So if you're not asking for a official MAPC position, I would say that efforts to manage and limit the growth of corporate or institutional ownership of multifamily housing as we make our way through this crisis would be something that I think the state should look at very, very seriously.
Another question that came in while we were talking, actually, Tim, you nicely already very directly began speaking to, which is, can folks comment on the possible effects of COVID on the regional housing market?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a relationship here. So what are the likely effects going to be, and what are the steps we should take to shape the effects that we want? All big questions, but any other thoughts on those threads?
Well, we're getting asked that question quite a bit, and working on a project to develop multiple recovery scenarios, looking at recovery of different industries or different occupations within industries in order to understand what income levels of households are likely to sort of rebound more quickly. We don't know what it'll be, but we can start to sketch out some possibilities and then look at the extent to which we might have a very broad-based depression in housing demand across both low income, middle income, and high income folks, or whether in some we might see a rebound among high income folks and then remain, have a lot of continue to have a lot of unemployment or underemployment among lower income households, which could put more pressure on them. So we're working on that now. I'm going to try to help illuminate that issue. I do see a question in here as well from somebody on sort of whether an increase in supply causes the price to go up or down in that same submarkets. I think that's a very hard thing to model. I think the real estate industry would pay handsomely for that sort of thing, but there's so many factors. So that's not, in response to that question, that's not something I think we're expecting is to sort of be able to simulate price, but we do want to focus on what do we think patterns of demand might be as we move through the recovery.
We just have a minute or two left. Maybe I'll end with a final question. Again, it's just anybody who's interested in taking it. Since this is a research conference, I'm curious if anybody in the course of their work really wished there was a data point that could have shed important light on the work they were doing, but that just wasn't available, and what that might be.
Yeah, I can start for that. So our project is not a research project. It was more like a community practice project, but I just wanted to share that some of our partners share their valuable data with us, but our tool mostly relies on publicly available data. So sometimes we couldn't find relevant data to show some of the difficult housing environment that residents are going through. So our data work group identified focus population groups for the data tool, including returning citizens and single fathers, but we were not able to find publicly available quantitative data to highlight these groups of people. So as an alternative, we actually hosted a storytelling workshop and invited some community residents who graciously agreed to share their stories so that we can share on our data tool. So if we had quantitative data, it would have been helpful to show quantitative evidence, but we also value stories and voices coming from our community as a qualitative data.
I would also highlight with regards to property ownership, one of the biggest problems is the ability of landlords to put every single one of their properties into a different LLC and then hide behind those LLCs. And even a very deep dive into the Massachusetts database will not uncover the majority of those LLCs and the ownership behind them. And so in order to have a really dynamic discussion at the neighborhood level between tenants, landlords, and city officials, you need to have that data. You need to be able to to know who is actually owning the properties in your neighborhood.
Really helpful. Unless Tom or Tim's chomping at the bit, that brings us exactly to 4:30 on my clock. Really appreciate the work you all are doing. Let me pass it to Dan to wrap us up. You're on mute.
Apparently everyone has to do that at least once today. Thank you, Luke. Very much appreciate you kind of leading us through the wilds here and guiding this conversation. And thank you so much to Tim, Nick, Tom, and Sujin for the great presentations. I thought this was a fantastic panel, personally. Just really got at, for me at least, and I hope for others in the audience, right, not only the inequities of housing as sort of an objective observation, but also some of the mechanisms that can perpetuate those inequities, looking at, Nick's talk especially, how just basically the people with capital create perverse incentives for policy, and then even to mechanisms to try to solve that problem, on the other hand, with things like Sujin and Tom's institutions, public data platforms and ways of communicating opportunities. So this was everything that we hope for in a panel. It was the data, it was the research, it was the co-creation. So thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it, and I hope and know that our audience did as well. So with that, final announcements for the day, and then we will disperse. So please join us next week for Supporting Greater Boston's Youth, another exciting panel looking at not necessarily public schools involved, but not necessarily just public schools, but how we're supporting youth in their socio-emotional development as well across Boston. And then for those who missed it, we announced our third slate of panels earlier this week, and they will follow. So next week is the last of the current slate of panels, as it were, and then we'll have 3 more panels after that on Census 2020, public education, so that one more formally on education in primary and secondary, and then traffic, which, you can't have a conference on Boston without talking about traffic, apparently. But with that said, right now, we are going to flip over in the next couple minutes to the BARI happy hour. I believe someone has posted the link for this on the Q&A. It is bit.ly/BARI happy. If you haven't seen it, capital BARI, lowercase happy. And there is a password, BARI, capital BARI. So please join us if you have an extra moment this afternoon and you want to chat with people about the talks. So with that said, again, thank you so much to the panel and the speakers, and to Luke for leading the way here. And thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you next week.